Thank you, Anqi and Cosmin, for inviting me here. And it's really an honor to be on this panel, the first day of this international conference. I must say that coming from a museum background and also ink art, a very entrenched traditional way of making art from very heavy schooling. I'm probably the least qualified person to be on this stage to talk about unschooling, but I'm learning to be unschooled. But I think most of us here are just spend an afternoon listening to very many different models of interventions in different parts of the world, different ways of learning and organizing. So before we begin, I'll sort of summarize what we learned today for maybe some of you just joined us halfway through. So we started with Andreas talking about Indonesia and his experience of building collectives. Collectives of people who are of different professions, perhaps in visual arts, engineering as he is, also different pockets of society to work together to make different kinds of I guess collective learning, beer making, or using that as a way to query the post-colonial and post-colonial history of Indonesia. Quite a huge undertaking, and of course he's not alone, working with a lot of different collaborators in many disciplines. Clara shared with us her design collective, if I may call it that, with 3 other collaborators in different time zones, working in ways to deal with perhaps the frustrations that they had with the Filipino government in this current situations, but also the way that they were all dispersed in different parts of the world, trying to make sort of a collaborative I guess visual artworks with design along with it. And she shared with a lot of the different experiences they've had as a collective, being invited to different parts of the world in terms of print books and artisans and so on. Christian showed us he told us he just completed his PhD dissertation, which is a great thing, a great relief, and nice to have him here after that. But also his work, École du Soir, at the Sculptural Center, using a format of exhibition and sculpture to instigate a different kind of way of learning, be it collective translation, and also basically instigating a new way of thinking of a master filmmaker from Africa. And then Lupe gave us a very dynamic presentation about Sosa, which he proudly wears on his T-shirt. This kind of collective school of rappers that they get together and find ways to learn about different things that might enrich and empower their, I guess, rap sheet. Anyway, I don't know much about these disciplines, but I'm trying my best. All right, so let's begin our École du Soir. I think I wanted to ask the panelists today, I think all of you had worked with different strategies and different tactics in your own communities, and also proliferating your work in different ways. Some of you have more structured programs, like SOSA is more or less a academic or a school for people to come learn together with a particular curriculum. Or an exhibition format like Christian's work, because there's a very much, I guess, filtered audience through exhibition making, but in also a physical structure. Whereas Andreas and Clara's ways of intervention are perhaps less structured in a physical way, maybe more nomadic, or maybe more maybe guerrilla style in different ways, in different realms, in internet or through communication. So with that, I wanted to ask the panelists maybe to tell us more about how you see your own work or your collective work fill in certain gaps in your communities, whether you see these gaps or the way the function that your works. Are they in parallel to these existing structures that you perhaps think are inefficient or frustrating? Or how do you find a way to make your work complementary to that, or interventionist? Because I think all of you have a little bit different attitudes toward this. So do you want to begin first, Andrea? You're sitting next to me. So.
More break time for the other panelists that just finished. Yeah, okay. I think I was just actually putting my last slides just a few minutes before I started. and this was a question that I was throwing to the audience, that when the main school stopped functioning, and our main spaces was stopped functioning, and the alternative space is more active than the main space. So which one is alternative? And it was a big question to myself as well. Coming looked into the activities that all the collectives are doing now. They are now more aware of this certain situation. That's why I was giving an example like Good School and of Ruang Rupa and a School of Improper Education of Kunci already try to build a certain curriculum that which considered quite radical in the more traditional school of arts in Indonesia. And I believe that I look at several examples also from other collectives. For example, like there is a friend in Bangalore, and they are working with the School of Design, Sristi School of Design. And to me, it is inspiring how in this school they accepted these radical thoughts and more fluid of teachings, and they incorporated with their curriculum of the school. I mean, like when I understand that that disciplines of schools come also from a long way of strategy of education, and but somehow I also see that it can become stagnant in a way. It have to be developed in many years after it become a curriculums. So I think that what the collectives was doing at the beginning was just trying to fill in what they couldn't get from the formal schools. Anyway, they initiated workshop, they initiated exhibition that didn't have any space to exhibit with. They give experience to the young artists and kind of feel of the infrastructure in the government in arts that stopped functioning. And after like decades of these collective activities, I think there's now each collective try to work together and to build a certain curriculum with each other. Of course, this is a very, very big commitment between the collectives, and I'm still don't know what's going to happen. And it will be interesting how to see after post reformation in 1998 of all these collectivities. I consider this like the second generation of collectives in Indonesia, and how they gonna evolve after that.
I think in the Philippines also, like around 1998, I think that was like a second wave of artist spaces. And then the third wave was in 2010-ish, which is when we started, not with the publishing house, but with like kind of this research and residency program or at least I learned to call it a research and residency program years after. But it was interesting. You know Merv Espina? Yeah. With Merv, he's like a researcher and also like runs his own collective in the Philippines. He's doing research on Southeast Asian artist-run spaces, and he identified like 2 moments where these alternative or autonomous structures were forming, and they were linked to like global financial crises. So I think in the 1998 it was the fall of the yen, and then 2010 was like a couple of years after the American like housing, like housing, the bubble burst. No, that was in Europe actually. Also, yeah. So it's interesting how these gaps become wider because of market like money flows and scarcity and austerity, which brings the need to respond. In our case, at least, it started because I felt like after living in Europe for 6 years and then coming back, there was this difference of looking at the Philippines after a period of migration and seeing that there were many things that I wanted to read or to know about, but that there were no books on the topics that I wanted to learn about. And after 3 years of doing this kind of, residency-based, in my living room residency, basically in my living room, in a house where I lived with my father, my brother, my daughter, and sometimes my sister. So it was this interesting like negotiation of the public and the private space, and also the space between the urban and the rural, because most of the cultural activity in the Philippines is it's a capital-centric system. So most of it was in Metro Manila. So it was like, what happens? Cultural capital is concentrated where it already exists. So the urge was to see in the rural or in the peri-urban or in the underserved spaces, then what happens when you bring this space, like with I really like the idea of the école du soir. So this alternative space to reach, to have conversations that perhaps don't travel, to people who are not included, and then also like dealing with your own privilege, because like now I'm in Europe and it's like, oh, I'm a person of color there. In the Philippines, I'm mixed race and I'm privileged and I'm not white, but so it's dealing with your own privilege and understanding how you can, it's guilt, I guess. It is guilt. It is this burden, and how do you redistribute access? And I think that was the main disquiet. And this morning I was talking with Elaine. Hi. Elaine and Elaine Ho and Ming Lin of Display Distribute, with whom we have this like WhatsApp group. This morning, or was it yesterday? I don't even remember anymore. We were talking about this idea of circulation, and the work that we do must circulate. Like you were talking about beds that aren't slept in and houses that aren't lived in, and what happens to books that don't circulate, and why do we publish them? So I've been thinking a lot of this idea of like content or research as like a life force, as like a vigor, and then this process of publishing as a form of bloodletting, and all these like different forms of like, so we were talking about books as leeches, and these things that you carry with you, like they're on you, they're on your body. Books don't travel on their own. You must circulate with them, at least if you publish in these sort of precarious conditions. So it's again relating this value to a bodily function, and that's for me why I decided to go this route, I guess, of like embodying the struggle and the emotional labor, and showing it with the body, because it's an urgency. And that's what I'm grappling with now, like coming from the Philippines where there's so much urgency, and then all of a sudden I'm in the Netherlands where everything's cute and orderly and there's so much design thinking and everything's laser cut. And it's, I don't see the urgency. I mean, for me, the urgency is like, you have so many resources, and then you walk into this like big art school with like all these crazy machines, and they're like, we don't have time and we don't have money. And I'm like, you are lying to me. This is time and this is money. And there's so many people in here, and how do we redistribute this? And for me, the urgency is a physical thing. So I guess that's, and a physical discomfort. So that's sort of where it's not really structureless, I would say. It's just maybe now I'm in a period of flux because I moved and these practices have to die. Like the OCD, which is the residency program, I killed it last year. And I called it a year of assisted suicide because it's like I knew I was going to leave, so it must die. And the only sustainable thing is the thing that dies and that leaves space. And now with the publishing practice, it's like, okay, it's still going, but I'm not there, and it's extremely material. And what do I do without my landscape, without my copy shops and my people and my comfort? So what does it look like now that I'm somewhere else? So I think, yeah, it's this idea of making space. You build a structure, and then the publishing landscape is very different in the Philippines now. So you build a structure, and I'm not saying that we built it on our own. We kind of rode also on this collective wave, I guess. But the publishing landscape is different. So maybe it's time to rewild the structure, and let's see what the plants do when they take it over. So I guess I don't know if that's filling the gaps, but that's sort of
Yeah, someone once told me that since we're talking about ways and forms or disformations of education, someone told me that education is not only to teach the mind, but it's also to look after the heart. So in a way, the forms of organizing or disorganizing that lose track of looking after the heart tend to not last very long because they might get a heart attack. Metaphorically or actually literally. And of course, it's not always up to the subject, actual or imagined or fictionalized, to attend to all the demands that befall upon that said subject. So I think in my case, I like to think of how any of these activities are fairly contingent on the mood and the feeling and also the generosity of those who contribute to them, partially because it's actually very hard to remunerate everyone following the ideal that I have or that they themselves have. So it's a constant arrangement and negotiation of the terms that can also be suspended any moment. So concretely, ways of meeting can vary according to who can actually be in a space at that moment. And so I think it's very hard to work out what the exact alternatives would be, other than paying close attention to the antecedents, I guess, histories, mapping them as far as that's humanly possible, and then suggesting possible futures in the form of you already talked about a number of your colleagues who are working on studying the histories of certain spaces. I think those are, I would say, important works. To that, I would add timelines. I also find that very important. I didn't get to talk about it, but that's one of the strategies that I find very I take comfort within it, not to see it as this immutable device that would that can act as a trophy or so, but more to realize that there are others who have had similar intuitions and feelings and worries, but also joys. So it's really good to share libraries in that way, and then also as a way of building resources or repositories, as fragile as those are, like the forms of publications that some of these activities might yield. So the fact that there could be like hundreds of those PDFs that one day materialize into printed matter. So yeah, in a way, an institution is not just a structure that is incorporated somewhere and that has like a tax number and so on, but it's also those that we carry within it, within each one of us. So I think all that put together can in itself become an institution today. Or I also really like the suggestion you made, Andreas, of the like a cooperative or I'm not sure the exact term you used, but that is subject to time as opposed to, say, space only. So yeah, there are ways of moving across these limits, and annoyingly, the moment you figure them out, yeah, the more you realize you actually know less about them. So, which is why it's a hard question to answer.
We have many mics. This one is mine. It was feeling abandoned. Like, use us, please. We have to. I mean, I think I'm a little bit more direct, maybe a little bit more USA about this. Pragmatic is what they call it. Thanks. I want social to be here for 1,000 years. You know, I don't want it to be ambiguous. I don't want it to be this like secret society that's off in the shadows. I want it to be a concrete institution around for 1,000 years that is not based on the charisma or the whether that charisma is a positive charisma or a negative charisma of the leader. That it is autonomous in that sense. That isn't reliant upon money, which is another thing that maybe I definitely didn't speak to it. But how is all that funded? And it's not funded, right? And how do you maintain that? How do you throw that in the mix and still create and sustain, right? And in some cases you can, in some cases you can't. So one of the challenges was we have to build the things that we're going to sell. We're not going to accept donations. We're not going to have patrons. We're not going to have that. Like, if we want to buy more books, we have to build something within SOSA to sell to the public to get that money to buy more books, right? But are we always going to be about that? Why don't we just write these books that we need? Well, can you just do that? Like, what do you need that book for? You need 20 copies of it. What's in it that you don't already have? Or what question can I ask you to instigate to get to the solution that you will find in that book so we don't have to buy it in the first goddamn place, right? But it's really that ambitious for me, and hopefully spreading that spirit through the rest of SOSA is we want it to be for 1,000 years, you know, and we mean that. And what do we need to do to get it there? It may not be what it is today 100 years from now, and 100 years after that, it may not be what it is at that point. So expect change, understand change, but what can we solidify right now, establish right now that will last? You know, Firmitas Utilitas Venustas was, you know, 5,000 years ago. You know, it's a very long time.
So like an empire.
Yeah, fuck yeah. You know, because why
I
not?
mean, you need like a divine ruler for that.
Not necessarily.
Generally.
I mean, a mandate from heaven would be nice.
Emperor, empress. Yeah.
But the idea is whatever that governance thing looks like. We want this to last for a long time. We want it to persist. We want it to be resistant. But in that resistance, meaning we want it to be flexible. So part of that process of being resistant and being able to be self-sustaining is also to be flexible and reactive to the times, right? And what do those times look like? But who determines what those times are? So that's the other piece. Why are you subjecting yourself to the whims of the times, the current affairs? How can you be flexible enough to persist? Or how can you set the tone? And that's one of the things that we set, hopefully in the minds of some of our participants and some of our ITs and our members, is like, you control the narrative. You literally control the narrative. You literally write the words that goes into the minds of the people. And you say, well, really? It's like, yes, your mind, the way we think, right? The way when we tell a story and it's visual and it's full of imagery, their mind becomes your mind. That's how we are able to relate to each other, is our minds physically, right, transform into that person's mind. That's the only way that we're able to receive communications, is by our mind becoming a certain parody of the storyteller, right? So on that level, cognitively, all the way down to any other level below that, you control the narrative. So fucking control it, right? But do it in the optimal way. Do it for the best of humanity. And if you're a supervillain, do it for the worst of humanity. That's fine, because we'll have a bunch of superheroes, to your point about Batman and Superman. You need to know the weaknesses, right? We need to know the dark parts, the dark arts of things. And they have their uses in certain capacities. But we want to have a full picture and a full scope of humanity, and you need to be able to speak to that. SOSA member. Yeah?
Can I make a suggestion for your curriculum?
Absolutely.
Maybe some gender studies.
Yes.
I think
Yeah.
you might need. Yeah, that was one
Yeah.
thing. I mean, and there was like I read this text actually, and your talk made me think about it. And this is one thing I've been quite interested in, like where does knowledge generate? Where does it come from?
Yeah.
And there's this really interesting text I read by two Indian authors. I forget who they are, but they were talking about knowledge management and knowledge production. So they were saying that knowledge production happens in the everyday. It happens in the street. It happens in the fields. It happens in craftsmen's guilds. And in academic institutions or in the institution, what they do is simply manage and reshuffle and kind of construct with knowledge that is actually produced in the everyday. So I thought it was really interesting that you're kind of tapping into this seed, and that's something that I've always searched for. Like, knowledge is not owned by institutions. In fact, institutions alienate those who produce knowledge. And the text was saying, and I do firmly believe this, that the key to, like, because I feel like your project is one of empowerment, or is that?
I mean, to the point of where you find yourself when you study this stuff. So we're open to everything. Like, we don't turn down anything. It could be gender studies, it could be alien studies, it could be, if there's something in that to make us better rappers, we're going to study it and analyze and tear down. So,
But you said rap is built in the wild.
mostly that's the state of the art.
But that's the amazing part, is that you already have it's so much harder to unlearn. I mean, it's so much harder to unlearn than it is to learn. And there are all these forms of knowledge production that are wild and that are completely, or maybe not completely, but outside of these restrictive paradigms. And I mean, I'm a 6-time college dropout, and I have no idea why I'm qualified to teach at a university, but apparently I am.
Same.
But I see it with my colleagues, is that it's so difficult for them to unlearn. Whereas I'm, the babe in the woods, or like Bambi, and it's easier to like learn structures. And as you learn them, you see where the cracks are. So it's much more nimble for me to go through the institution. And you already, like, with SOSA, the basis is that everything is, or things are unlearned. So I feel like, it would be nice to have this position where you said, oh, we're not professors. I'm like, yeah, you are.
Well, I mean, I say that in a certain level of jest. Not to be too pretentious, but to be entertaining. But the one of the truths of it is, and we had this argument about wildness versus the institution, and the response was wildness is an institution, right? And it just becomes assess it, analyze it. You'll start to figure out that a lot of the things that you think as a rapper are wild aren't really that wild. They're actually very much so domesticated. Like you just going into the structure of a song is a commercial product. It has nothing to do with anything biological, nothing to do with anything philosophical. It's a purely commercial act. And we're trying to break you from that, right? But also master that. If that's going to be the case, master that form completely, right? And understand it completely, and then put it in the toolbox with the rest of the things that you know. To the point about gender studies, which is super interesting because through rap studies, again, we said we introduce rappers to 50, 60 different rappers. And through that education, you go back, all the way back to 1979, to who was the first conscious rapper. Who was the first rapper talking about politics and standing up against the system and the injustices in the criminal system? It was her. Her name was Sweet Tea. She's actually one of our ITs, so she's one of the social members, one of Grandmasters. And she was, I think, 15 when she was doing this. But she was credited as releasing the first. And so we got this room full of dudes who were like, yeah, conscious rappers, backpacks with dudes walking around with Timberland boots, And it was like, no, it was this 15-year-old teenage woman in New York who was speaking, and then she became the framework to produce. And it wasn't in a wild space. It was a commercial release. So her piece was wildness in the streets, yes, but I need to convert that wildness into something distributable, something easily palatable, and the machine that does that the best, unfortunately or fortunately, is this commercial releases, right? So it's interesting the things that you bump into just by looking at stepping back, not with no assumptions, with no biases. We're not trying to change anything, just assessing what's there and looking at the totality of what's there, and you'll see that a lot of those things already exist. They're already there. It's not nothing that needs to be searched for or added. It just needs to be presented in the proper format. But yes, gender studies, please. If you have a couple novels,
one other
please.
thing that I keep thinking about in these conversations or in the questions that you posed is, just there's another kind of complication that seems to disappear very quickly, which is, I guess you can sum it up by a blackout. Like, what if there's a blackout? Like, suddenly in this room, there's no electricity, nothing. What kind of either thinking or recording or institutionality or even rapping or walking then becomes necessary or doable or thinkable? And I think actually I would say that one of the urgent challenges we have is to think with the blackout or without the blackout. And so that it's very hard to assert that one can, of course the wish is there to last for as many centuries and millennia, but it's also hard, particularly today, to do so. When you think, I'm saying this simply because, a lot of ideas and challenges that, again, has been had often take place precisely where there's already a blackout. And so, and it seems to me that, just because it's something that in a way we have to, it doesn't have to be said, but it should be taken for granted that actually electricity is not to be taken for granted as it is. And that's all it takes to suddenly deregulate who knows what. And so I feel that, when we wish, it's also important to account for the possible infirmities that can befall any of us in terms of, becoming blind, losing the agility that we all have.
Apocalypse.
Just to be able to sit on a flight for 15 hours in order for me to be able to say this. Well, you have to be really fit to be able to do that for a start. So a blackout is not only, say, for a building or a street, but it's also within. And so then what kind of, body, subject, mind, ideas, feelings become and possible, if that is even in order at that point. And so, yeah, I think that it's hard to know and to predict, and the only thing one can do is to prepare for when that happens, and there are all kinds of ways of doing so. But it's also good to acknowledge that there is already that specific blackout going on, and yeah, I guess to recall it and remember when that happens, what is it that we do? Do we like start to walk with our hands out like this, and not just as a metaphor, but it actually really can happen. So one of those ways is, I don't know, funding cuts. That's one ugly institutional manner, but it can also go far. And we're in Hong Kong, where there are already difficulties as they stand. So, yeah, I think it's important to include that. It's I don't know. I don't think it's negativity, but you can call it maybe affirmative self-negation. I don't know. And then just so that you work from there, and then it's not even in order to be steps ahead. It's just because that's the reality in itself. Except that the joke of it all is that it's not visible, but that's the most visible. I don't want to say blackness cheaply, but but it's because it's there. So it's also important to materialize it.
Well, there's interesting fun fact about blackouts, literal blackouts in hip hop, is that hip hop was born out of a blackout. New York, 1970s, there was a huge blackout for days. What do you think happened? People stole turntables, right? They stole them. They were too expensive, right? They stole turntables. And when the lights came back on, it's like, hey, all the turntables are missing. And hip hop was being invented in the Bronx. Good choice. Right? So when electricity came back on, it was like, we got turntables. And turntables, why would you steal turntables? There's no power, right? It's like, the power will, but when the power comes back, we will be ready, So there's ways to operate and still produce inside of a blackout.
And the Philippines, they're actually called brownouts, which I thought always was quite interesting, like how the idea of darkness actually has, a Malay shade. So, yeah, it was interesting. For us, it's a brownout. And I'm like, what do you mean blackout? It was a brownout.
I think one of the ways to sustain an empire for 1,000 years is to be agile, whether it's in darkness or in light. So I think lots of questions I can feel the heat in the room that people want to get more enlightened by our speakers. So I will turn to you guys. Already questions, please. Yes, microphones will go to you.
Question is for Clara. Thanks for that very thoughtful talk. My question is basically, what is your attachment to the studio as the vehicle or as the primary organization for design practice? And I'm asking you because in architecture, hierarchy as well as collaboration are things that are implicit in the model of the studio as well as its working methods. And I think of how there's an entire industry of new communications technologies that have been designed to address the ways that neoliberal capitalism has sort of scattered the studio, right? So I guess if I think of the way that, a big firm like OMA would have dealt with the dispersal of the members of its studios across the world is that they'd use these technologies to create a kind of simulacrum in which everyone appeared to be in the room at the same time. And what I really found inspiring about your talk was the way that was the structure, and how the structure of your talk was really true to a certain physical dislocation of the members of your studio, but also that was really true to your working methods, which I thought opened up a kind of critical practice for design that I think you don't really see coming from studios like OMA. And I realize I'm comparing architecture to graphic design, but they're both kind of have the same organizational model. So.
It was interesting actually because we don't call ourselves a studio, we call ourselves a house, like H-A-U-Z, because that's the kind of like a jokey vernacular Filipino way of spelling like a noodle house, and they just put a Z in it because it looks cute. And if we ever refer to ourselves as a studio, it's a studio-less studio. And I think the ones that have studios are Christian and Dante. Like it's they have their studios in the States, but because they're brought up in this modernist tradition where design or art or whatever or like visual acrobatics happen within the framework of a studio. For me, it's always been a house because that's where I live and I work, and I prefer that. Like I have a kid. I was away for 6 years in Spain, so I missed 6 years of her life. And when I came back, I had like a space for a while, and then it was too much traffic. So this idea of circulation keeps like. Recurring, this idea that if you have like a studio outside of your house in a city like Metro Manila, circulation is congested, so you actually don't have that much time to work and live. So I prefer doing it in my home and dealing with this idea of what happens when you bring, and this is like the condition of the entreprecariat as well. Like there is no division between personal and private, and you don't know where your work body ends and your family body begins. But that I think is interesting. And Czar, on the other hand, he also is a studio-less photographer. And I think this idea of using the city and using the street as your studio, and if you want a studio visit, then Czar will take you around his neighborhood and take you to have coffee and go to secondhand stores, and I will invite you to my home and ask you to pick a teacup, and then we'll have a 5-hour meeting, which is impossible or not, like inefficient within the structure of the studio. Because you're supposed to be able to be efficient, but it's like, no, you should come, let's eat, let's have some tea, tell me about your life, and when we're done, and I think the studio for me is interesting in terms of the word study, and this is something that I've been discussing a lot with colleagues, this idea of where can study happen as well. So where does knowledge generate and where does study happen? And within institutional structures, and here we're reading. We actually have a reading group on the theory of the undercommons. So this idea that study can't happen within an institutional framework because it's too structured. What happens when you eat? What happens when you paint your nails? Which actually I like doing. I like painting my nails, or when you sew, or when you're otherwise occupied, but actually engaging in theoretical discussions. And this for me is more interesting, the act of studying, than the place where it happens. And study can happen anywhere. Maybe perhaps, I think, it's more difficult within an institutional structure.
I was reminded that we have only 5 minutes. I don't know how time passed, but we are allowed.
I'm interested in maybe how you conceive of like places of study or forms of study within.
We have in Indonesia we have like a place to study, and it was called sanggar. And the sanggar, you basically sit on the floor with the teacher, and you make like a circle. So it's more like the teacher have to look to everyone else, and this and during this we call it also like a nyantrik. Nyantrik is like a residency that you live with the teacher, but there's certain obligation that because you're living together, you have like the obligation to clean up the space. You have the obligation to shop, to cook, to wash together because it's a shared space, and it become an intention attachment between the students and the teacher, and that's why a lot of artists, if you see in the theater in Indonesia, they still have this. They still have this attachment to their teacher, and because in theater they have this form of disciplines that they're practicing in their art. So it is a bit disappearing though, but from in this collectives you can see also it is still somehow the same way. The form of the place in Sanggar is just open space. It's just everybody can go in on it. It's not a closed door. I don't know. Maybe it's have a influence because it was too hot in Indonesia. I don't know. But in a way, also it's kind of like showing that this is an open space where people can come to learn together. In Indonesia, the collective now is a bit closed. It's more like a private house. But because we are like our architecture was built by the Dutch, and somehow but somehow this housing actually really need air conditioning, while our old housing was like open doors. So in the housing in our area, we always open the door because it's just too hot. It's just to allow to the air circulates. Sometimes your neighbor come, and then keep talking for you like 2 hours. And that's why I was like saying like, it is impossible for the studio when you're like, you want to work on something and then the neighbor just like, keep talking to you for 2 hours about cats or cows, So, so in this form, like, I don't see like many artists doesn't have a studio actually in Indonesia, and we work with a space, a shared space basically. That's why. Sometimes we can borrow our friend's space, and somehow there's a negotiation on that. Like, hey, you bring me drink if you want to use my, something like this between friends. But anyway, we're used to sharing this space, and this is kind of like our strategy on how we produce in artistic production and also in schools basically.
I have one quick question for Lupe. What happened? You left us with a cliffhanger of a story. Remember, you started off and then you were picked up in this car and then you never picked up your sister. What happened to her? Yeah, yeah. Like, did you get punished? What did your dad say?
I can't remember what happened. I don't remember what happened. Actually, I think I got a lift home, or something like that. I don't think I picked her up though. Like, I don't think any of that happened. I apologize. I don't apologize, but I mean, I got a record deal out of it, so I'm not really worried about it.
Unfortunately, I think our time's up. I think this has been a very fruitful conversation, and I think it's been a very enriching afternoon, if you would agree. So please join me in thanking the speakers today, and thank you all for staying with us for this first day.